This is just a quick, what I hope is a relatively quick introduction to the idea of research fluency, which is a concept I've been working on for a while now, and which is intended to act as a loose framework for thinking through the development of research at different levels within universities, but also perhaps to act as a starting point for dialogue with individuals if we're in a position of helping them think about how they want to develop their research trajectory. It works on a number of basic assumptions. The first of which is that research is really quite a complex process. To become a really good researcher requires consistent and continued engagement by the individual, either by themselves or as part of a wider group, for their understanding and practice as a researcher to become well developed. And this is why I've chosen the idea of fluency, that being fluent in something is about having a good understanding of it, but also being able to apply it in practice. And this comes from a feeling that to a certain extent, some of the frameworks that already exist tend to be sort of deficiency led, that a number of issues might be identified, tick lists, things like that, to show where there are deficiencies in somebody's development, and then really the support that's given, or training, professional development, call it what you will, is very much about plugging gaps. And I think one of the issues with that is that we can get to a stage where much of the focus then tends to be on doctoral researchers and early career researchers. And I think there's, in a sense, nothing wrong with that. These are the groups that perhaps we're trying to help develop their research fluency as a major part of what they do. But obviously, there are then questions about where perhaps research in relation to undergrad and masters fits in, and also perhaps an implicit assumption that more senior researchers are wholly independent, can sort all their problems out for themselves, rather than thinking of both those earlier groups and more senior researchers as being people who could benefit from dialogue around research development as well, and thinking about how they too can become more fluent in the research that they carry out. And I think one of the issues with the frameworks that we have at the moment is that there is a chance, I'm not saying they always do, but there's a chance that they can create quite a reductive notion of research, as being really around transferable skills, employability and research methods, when actually I would argue that research fluency is a much broader and indeed deeper set of ideas and processes and practices. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to try and think about how we might begin to create perhaps a different view of research, as being an activity embedded within wider academic cultures. It's actually part of our work as academics. Certainly, it's a minority of people who are only doing research and not doing other things. And also thinking about that sort of cultural aspect at the same time as the sort of various traits, competencies, skills, etc., knowledge which emerge within individuals. And if we try and take that whole holistic set of principles, that essentially becomes the core of this concept of research fluency. It shares in the thinking about this with the concept of pedagogic literacy, which Vassal Cycler and myself wrote about back in 2016, and there we talked about the idea that everybody has the capacity to teach. Kids teach other kids, kids teach parents, parents teach kids, but actually what makes somebody a teacher, a professional teacher if you like, is actually about them then honing those skills, understanding them, reflecting upon them and developing them. Likewise, the idea of research fluency comes from the starting point that all humans tend to have a tendency to experiment and to research in very informal ways. And that sort of informal process of research doesn't necessarily follow what academic researchers would understand as coherent and acceptable. They're not explicit designs that are thought through to minimize inaccuracies and biases, etc. But nevertheless, there's an innate sort of interest in that most humans have to actually try things out, carry out almost sort of folk experiments, if you like, to actually help them solve problems, even in sort of day-to-day issues. And therefore, I see this as being, if you like, the basis for research fluency, and that becoming a researcher, becoming fluent in research, is therefore really a case of degree, experience, knowledge, and application. That actually what we're doing all the way through school careers with things like science lessons, particularly, and then into university, is actually helping people to gain greater experience, greater knowledge, begin to understand application, etc., to begin to develop well thought through, critical, good research. So, in a sense, research fluency is coming from this same notion of pedagogic literacy. And as with pedagogic literacy, one of the things that I would argue is that we never become fully fluent, that actually there's no end point that is ever reached, that research itself is such a vast area that there's always different ways of understanding things, new ways of understanding things, new research designs and approaches to research are constantly being created. And therefore, research fluency is something that can continue to be developed right across an academic career as new opportunities arrive, as we as researchers reflect on what we've done and think about how we might want to do things differently, as we experiment and create new ways of gaining insight. And as a result, if we're doing it right, we're also learning from the research of others, and therefore that level of fluency is always capable of being developed further, both in terms of our understanding of research, but also our practice of it and our way of using it to give us insight into the problems that we're interested in. As a consequence, it's actually a complex and time-consuming process, becoming ever more fluent in research, and involves a series of dimensions. I think, however, one of the things to think about is that if we accept that it is a complex system that we are evolving within, it becomes impossible to capture the entirety of that process. It's impossible to capture the entirety of research fluency in a model, because if we did, the model would need to be as large as the reality it attempts to summarize, as Cilliers would argue in his work through complexity theory. So what is offered here is really a philosophical framework. It's offered as the basis for ongoing dialogue between researchers, an ongoing dialogue between academics who have areas of research within the programs that they teach, and thinking about the order in which they want to expose students to research and to understanding and applying research. And what should be at the center of that is a constant reflective dialogue about how that can be done better, and indeed how we as researchers can develop. What it isn't is an exhaustive tick list of skills and competencies. So it's always a bit worrying that whenever you give a series of things that could be included within a framework such as this, or in our earlier work with pedagogic literacy, that people will begin to see the things that you include as these are the things, this is the core of the model, and what we need to be doing is ticking these off and showing that we're doing them, or showing that we're doing them at a particular level. It's not that kind of framework. It's a philosophical framework which is merely there to help people reflect and enter into dialogues to develop their practice or develop their programs further. And there are sort of 7 general dimensions, if you like, that are currently in this conceptualization of research fluency: research ethics, philosophies and positionalities, disciplinary specialisms, research and development and skills, which tends to be the area that a lot of focus is given to, I think, in many of the pre-existing frameworks, critical reading and writing, academic cultures, and research design. So just to give an idea of the kind of things that could be included in these, if we take research ethics first, I've sort of labelled the idea of aspects within each dimension, but these are purely illustrative, and hopefully within any kind of professional development activity, any kind of coaching or mentoring that's going on at whatever level in terms of program design, these aspects would literally just be a way of igniting a wider discussion that is contextually relevant to the individual or the pair or the group who are undertaking the dialogue and the development of some kind of developmental process. So within research ethics, the kind of things I've included here are quite sort of practical, mechanistic things like ethical approval systems. Do people understand how they work, why they work like they do? Do they understand some of the arguments about, is this taking ethics more into legal areas of thought, or is it really purely ethical? But then also thinking about research ethics itself as a wider area of writing and research, and a lot of the kind of research ethics debates that are alive in disciplines across the academic spectrum. And then also trying to give people, not in any kind of massive depth, certainly to begin with, but some idea of the notion of ethical traditions, virtue ethics, utilitarianism, etc. Trying to give people an understanding that ethics in its own right is an area for debate, and therefore one that, should they feel it's important within the kind of research they're doing, that they might want to take that understanding further, rather than seeing research ethics as quite a technical aspect of their work that is really just about filling in a form, doing the basics clearly and well, and then once you have the ethical approval, then you're good to go and you can just get on with the research. So it's that idea of thinking about the practical aspects of it, critiquing them, but then trying to go both broader and deeper into understanding ethics as a set of ideas and a set of traditions. In terms of philosophies and positionality, obviously beginning to talk about ontology and epistemology, the nature of evidence, and what within the particular discipline that you're working within, what you see as being the nature of evidence, and how that fits in to the whole research process, and what is deemed to be high quality evidence and what isn't. And again, there's a difference in how that's perceived across different disciplines. Thinking about paradigms, reflexivity, and the importance of reflexivity in developing research in particular contexts, and also particularly researcher positionality, and thinking through issues around insider outsider researchers, power relationships, etc., etc. And then finally also the idea of philosophical traditions, and again thinking through, as with ethical positions, thinking through some of the different philosophical traditions that underpin a lot of these discussions, to give a critical and hopefully relatively firm philosophical basis for the kind of research that we're carrying out. Disciplinary specialism. Um, I think sort of one of the issues with trying to develop researchers, particularly pre-doctoral and doctoral, is that we can begin to see, if we're not careful, research as a set of skills and something in its own right that isn't linked to the discipline necessarily. So thinking about making sure that there are discussions about knowledge of content, where should we be looking? From my own sort of interdisciplinary field of education, for example, there's a huge amount on leadership, but actually you could argue that knowledge of content and certainly cognate content, why aren't we looking in, say, the organizational sciences much more for a lot of the really fantastic critical research that's in that area that could actually support a lot of our thinking within certain areas of educational research. Some of the theoretical and philosophical perspectives in our disciplines, disciplinary uses and perspectives on evidence, similar to Dimension 2, and then things like applications of disciplinary knowledge. So really ensuring that knowledge is an explicit element in the way that we think about and develop our work as researchers. Dimension 4, research and development and skills, the kind of things that quite often now are seen as being at the core of a lot of the generic training, particularly at things like doctoral level. So it's not to sort of say that that isn't important, but it's only one dimension within this wider notion of research fluency. So things like career development, collaborative approaches, understanding notions of interdisciplinarity and how you can work successfully in an interdisciplinary way, nuts and bolts of things like project management, knowledge exchange and impact, which are obviously ever more important, and then things like transferable skills development. And there's a certain perspective from some that transferable skills don't really exist, that they're all disciplinary, but I would argue that there's certainly transferable skills across, if you like, disciplines that are close to your own. There's almost like a distance decay effect. So if I'm working in something like quaternary science, so looking at the evidence in relation to the dynamics of ice ages, which is often something that is located within a geography department, it's what I did my PhD in, then actually there's a lot of transferable skills, and it's a lot easier to talk to, say, geologists than it is to talk to historians, because actually some of the skills and some of the assumptions and ways of working are very similar, because actually they're quite close in a disciplinary sense. Dimension 5 is the whole sort of area of critical reading and writing, and I think this is where my original idea of research literacy came from, was that we were teaching a research methods course at master's level, and traditionally that had just been seen really as research design and research methods and data analysis. And one of the things that we did, because we thought it is really, really important, is to actually make it really clear that sitting right in the center of the research process alongside those things is an ability to read critically, because that's setting you up for the kind of practical research that you might do. And then obviously at the other end, or alongside that and emerging out of the research you're doing, being able to write in an academic style that's clear, but also is something that you can do for different media and different audiences. So again, a number of aspects around developing critical reading and writing. Dimension 6 is part of the wider aspect of being a researcher, that idea of academic cultures. So thinking about professionalism, research ethics, linking back to Dimension 1, academic metrics and accountability, understanding things like the ref and the position that you are in relation to that, understanding perhaps the politics of research and the politics of academia, understanding wider aspects around funding and bids and how that fits within particularly your own discipline, but more widely, other academic responsibilities, because obviously, as I said previously, for many people, they're not full-time researchers. They have teaching or admin responsibilities. So how do you navigate those academic cultures to allow you to develop your research in a positive way? And then finally, also building academic networks. And if you're trying to do all of this in what are often quite intense cultures in universities now, how do you manage all of that and still keep a level of well-being and a sense of perhaps balance in the kind of work you're doing, as opposed to sort of elements of your life outside of research? And then finally, perhaps and more obviously, issues around research design. So thinking through the whole um, structures, if you like, and approaches to research design, understanding methodologies critically, when you might want to use them, when they might be most useful, data collection, analysis, interpretation, etc. And what's important, and what I'd stress again and reiterate, is that all of these aspects are just a starting point, and at any point in time for a particular individual, some of them may be less relevant than others, or some people may feel more confident in some than they do others. So the idea isn't that you're trying to grapple with all 7 dimensions all at the same time, but actually you're looking at these and sort of think, right, where do I think I am? Where do I think I need to go next? And therefore, which of these dimensions or even aspects within dimensions might be useful for me at this time to develop further? And therefore, this is something that I would hope is useful from day one at undergraduate all the way up to senior academic. And as I keep saying, is about a philosophical framework that is a starting point for reflection and dialogue. So, for example, in my current role, we're going to start doing quite a lot of one-to-one coaching with early career researchers. We're going to sort of start working on some of these aspects to create online support for doctoral students. The idea would be, therefore, that this is just a way of sort of saying, well, look, there are these different dimensions. Where do you think you need to go next, and how can we support you in doing that? And as a consequence, this whole framework for research fluency, as far as I'm concerned, is about finding another channel through which we can become far better learning organisations, to think about the kind of academic development that people feel that they need to help them move to the next level in the research that they're doing. So this is just an outline really, and it is something that we're working on to try and make very practical over the next couple of years.